Hi, my name is Diana. I'm a tour guide at the Chester Beatty. Today I would like to introduce you to two consecutive pages from the book of Genesis, chapter 37. They were written in Greek on papyrus sheets in Egypt in the first half of the 4th century CE and bound into a codex. The Greek version of the Hebrew Bible is known as the Septuagint, meaning 70. This name derives from the tradition that the translation was the work of some 70 Jewish elders. Accounts of this translation survive in the works of ancient writers, including Philo of Alexandria and Josephus. Yet the oldest source appears to be a 2nd century BCE treatise known as the Letter of Aristeas. Aristeas claims to be a courtier of King Ptolemy II Philadelphus, who ruled Egypt from 285 to 246 BCE. According to him, Ptolemy wished to expand his famous library at Alexandria, so he sent Aristeas along with an embassy to Jerusalem to request a copy of the law attributed to Moses. Aristeas duly returned to Alexandria, accompanied by 72 learned Jewish elders, 6 from each Israelite tribe, bearing a copy of the Torah, or first 5 books of the Hebrew Bible. The elders were hospitably received and wowed the king when he tested their wisdom at royal banquets. They were taken to the island of Pharos, just off the coast of Alexandria, where they translated the Torah, comparing their individual versions in order to produce a common text, a task they completed in 72 days. Ptolemy then ordered the translation to be read before the assembled Jewish population of the city, who was so delighted by its accuracy, Aristeas claims, that they insisted it never be changed, and requested that a copy be made for their leaders. Ptolemy also is said to have been deeply impressed. The Bibliomania of the Ptolemies is amply attested. Royal agents scoured the major Mediterranean book markets, and foreign ships that docked at Alexandria were searched for books. The confiscated originals were added to the great library, and copies were returned to the owners. Ptolemy III Euergetes is said to have borrowed the master copies of tragedies of Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides from the Athenians, forfeiting the hefty deposit he had paid to guarantee their return. Hence it is not inconceivable that the law of Moses, considered by Greeks to have been a wise worker of miracles, may have been desired by an Egyptian king. However, as Greek was the official language in the Hellenistic kingdoms, it's likely that the translation actually arose out of the need of the Jewish community at Alexandria. Today, the authenticity of Aristeas' letter is universally doubted. It was likely a work of propaganda aimed at substantiating the integrity of the Greek translation. Over time, the story of the translation was embellished. It was claimed that the Jewish elders had been divinely inspired, and that although they had worked in separate cells, their individually rendered translations miraculously agreed. The Septuagint soon came to be viewed by the Jewish diaspora as a valid equivalent of the Hebrew Torah, and was expanded from the original 5 books to include later books of the Hebrew Bible. The Septuagint was also adopted by early Christians unfamiliar with Hebrew, who mined it for proof that Jesus was a fulfillment of Hebrew prophecy. Ironically, this adoption of the Septuagint by Christians ultimately led many Jews to abandon it and return to using Hebrew and Aramaic biblical versions in the 2nd century CE. The Chester Beatty has 2 papyrus manuscripts from Egypt containing the Greek version of the book of Genesis. Dated to the 3rd and 4th century CE, they are among the oldest known surviving copies in the world. Taken together, they contain almost the entire text of Genesis. Chapter 37 relates the story of Joseph and his brothers, who resided in the land of Canaan. Joseph was the next youngest of Jacob's 12 sons. Not only had he been favored by his father with a coat of many colors, but he was often sent by Jacob to check on his older half-brothers as they tended flocks. When Joseph revealed to his brothers dreams that implied he would someday surpass them, they became envious and plotted against him. They sold him to a passing caravan merchant and brought Joseph's robe, which they had bloodied, to their father. Surmising that his son had been killed by a wild animal, Jacob went into deep mourning. The caravan traveled to Egypt, where Joseph was sold to Potiphar, captain of the Egyptian king's guard. Our text then diverges to discuss Judah's marriages and offspring. Later in Genesis, the tale of Joseph resumes. Potiphar made Joseph overseer of his house and estate, which prospered under Joseph's care. But when Joseph spurned the advances of Potiphar's wife, she falsely accused him of rape, and Joseph was flung into prison. There, Joseph was put in charge of other prisoners, including Pharaoh's chief cupbearer, whose dream, when explained by Joseph, came to pass. Later, when Pharaoh had a dream that baffled his advisors, the cupbearer suggested that Joseph interpret it. Joseph revealed that Pharaoh's dream signified 7 years of famine would follow 7 years of plenty, and he advised Pharaoh to store up food to mitigate the disaster. Pharaoh was so grateful that he appointed Joseph vizier, or prime minister, of Egypt. During the years of plenty, Joseph filled the royal granaries and storehouses with food. When the famine began, hunger drove many neighboring peoples to Egypt in search of assistance. Among them were Joseph's half-brothers, who did not recognize him. Joseph would send all but one brother back to Canaan, their donkeys loaded with grain, on condition that they return with their youngest sibling, who was Joseph's full brother, Benjamin. Back at Canaan, the brothers discovered that the money they had paid for the grain had been returned. The next year, Jacob ordered his sons to return to Egypt for more grain. This time they brought Benjamin. Joseph received them at his home and secretly rejoiced on seeing Benjamin. He gave orders that his brothers' donkeys be loaded with supplies, again restoring the payment that they had made. Joseph also had his silver cup hidden in Benjamin's sack. After they departed, Joseph sent a steward after them. When the cup was found among Benjamin's possessions, they returned to Joseph's house, where Joseph declared that the owner of the sack in which the cup had been found must become his slave. At this, Judah, who earlier had instigated the plot against Joseph, asked to take Benjamin's place. Hearing his plea, Joseph wept and revealed his true identity. At first they were afraid, but Joseph convinced them that he bore no grudge. God had turned their mischief into good. He ordered them to bring Jacob, his household, and flocks back to Egypt, where they could weather the famine. And so it came to pass that Jacob and Joseph beheld one another tearfully once again. During the years that followed, Pharaoh would bestow his favor on Joseph's brethren, who thrived in the land of Egypt. I do hope that before long you will pay a visit to the Chester Beatty and check out the alcove in which some of our Greek biblical papyri are displayed.